Behind the weathered planks of an abandoned barn in the Wyoming Territory, a desperate man clutches a rotten apple like it's his last meal on earth. Jake Morrison, once a proud ranch hand, has fallen so far that even spoiled fruit seems like a blessing. His clothes hang loose on his gaunt frame, and his hollow eyes tell the story of a man who's given up on tomorrow. Then she appears, heavy with child, her own dress patched and worn, yet her eyes hold a warmth that cuts through the bitter mountain air. Sarah Whitmore has nothing to spare, yet when she sees Jake's condition, she doesn't hesitate. She opens her small satchel and offers him fresh bread, speaking to him not as a stranger, but as someone worthy of kindness. What neither of them knows is that this simple act of compassion will spark a transformation that will change both their lives forever. But can two broken souls truly heal each other when the harsh frontier tests every bond? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1882 was a land that demanded everything from those who dared to call it home. The mountains stood like ancient sentinels against a sky that could shift from crystalline blue to slate gray in the span of a heartbeat. Cedar Falls, nestled in a valley where the Cedar River carved its patient path through granite and pine, was the kind of settlement that existed because it had to, a place where people gathered not by choice, but by the simple human need to survive together. Sarah Whitmore pressed her hand against the small of her back as she walked down the town's main street, her other hand resting protectively over the growing curve of her belly. 6 months along now, and every step reminded her of the weight she carried, not just the child, but the burden of being alone in a world that had little patience for women without men to speak for them. The wedding ring that had once adorned her finger now hung from a thin silver chain around her neck, tucked beneath her worn calico dress. Thomas had been dead 4 months now, crushed beneath a falling tree while clearing land for what was to be their homestead. The ring against her skin was both comfort and reminder, a talisman of love lost, and a symbol of the protection she no longer had. She had come west, following the promise Thomas had made about his brother's ranch, about family that would welcome them, about a future where their child would have room to grow under endless skies. But Thomas's brother had moved on years ago, leaving no forwarding address, and Sarah found herself stranded in Cedar Falls with dwindling funds and a landlady who grew more impatient with each passing day. The general store stood at the corner of Main and Cedar, its false front painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to the color of old butter. Sarah pushed through the door, the brass bell announcing her arrival with a musical chime that seemed almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Behind the counter, Martha Chen looked up from her ledger with eyes that held the particular shrewdness of someone who had learned to read people like the sky reads weather. Martha was one of the few Chinese settlers who had remained after the railroad work moved on, finding a place in Cedar Falls through sheer determination and an unparalleled ability to know exactly what people needed before they knew it themselves. Her black hair was streaked with premature silver, pulled back in a practical bun that framed a face marked by laugh lines, and the kind of weathering that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martha said, her voice carrying the faint accent. That marked her origins, though she had been in the territory longer than most of the folks who called themselves natives. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well enough, thank you. I was hoping to speak with you about extending credit for a few more days. Mrs. Henley has made it clear that my rent is overdue, and I'm afraid I won't have the money until I can find some work." Martha's expression softened with the kind of sympathy that came from someone who understood what it meant to be alone in an unforgiving place. "You know I'd help if I could, dear, but times are hard for everyone, and I've got my own debts to settle." She paused, her fingers drumming against the wooden counter, though I did hear Mrs. Patterson might be looking for someone to help with her washing. She's getting on in years, and her arthritis has been troubling her something fierce." Before Sarah could respond, the bell chimed again, and both women turned to see Jake Morrison step through the doorway. Sarah recognized him immediately, the man from behind the barn, though he looked different now. He had cleaned himself up as best he could, his hair combed back with water, his clothes brushed free of the worst dirt, but the gauntness remained, and his eyes still held that haunted quality of someone who had seen too much of life's darker corners. Jake removed his hat, a gesture so automatic it spoke of breeding, that ran deeper than his current circumstances. "Ma'am," he said to Martha, then turned to Sarah with a slight nod. "Mrs. Whitmore." The fact that he remembered her name, that he had bothered to learn it, struck Sarah as unexpectedly touching. In her experience, men in Jake's position, desperate, proud, reduced to accepting charity, often turned their shame outward, becoming bitter or aggressive. But there was something different about Jake Morrison, something that suggested the man he had been still lived beneath the hardship that had befallen him. Martha watched the exchange with interest, her merchant's eye noting the undercurrents of familiarity. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "I haven't seen you in town for some time." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Been keeping to myself mostly. But I was wondering if you might have any work available. I'm willing to do whatever needs. Doing, loading, cleaning, repairs. I'm handy with most tools." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken history. Sarah could sense the weight of whatever had happened to bring Jake Morrison to this point, the kind of fall from grace that small towns remembered and rarely forgave. Martha's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight shake of her head. "I'm sorry, Jake. Business has been slow, and I can't afford to take on help right now." Jake accepted the rejection with a dignity that somehow made it more painful to witness. He replaced his hat and turned to leave, but Sarah found herself speaking before she had fully formed the thought. "Mr. Morrison," she said, and he paused with his hand on the door. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in helping a lady with some heavy lifting. I'm afraid I'm not supposed to be doing such things in my condition, and there are some supplies I need moved." It wasn't entirely a lie. There were indeed some sacks of flour and cornmeal that Mrs. Henley had asked her to move from the boarding house's storage room. But Sarah's real motivation was harder to define, something that had to do with the way Jake had offered her that first kindness behind the barn, and the recognition that they were both adrift in a world that had little patience for those who struggled. Jake studied her face, and Sarah had the distinct impression that he could see right through her charitable impulse to the loneliness beneath. But instead of calling her on it, he simply nodded. "I'd be glad to help, Ma'am. No charge, of course." "Nonsense," Sarah said, reaching into her small purse. "A laborer deserves his wages." She counted out $2 silver, money she couldn't spare, but somehow couldn't keep either. "Will this be sufficient?" Jake looked at the coins in her palm for a long moment, and Sarah could see the war between pride and necessity playing out in his expression. Finally, he reached out and took the money, his fingers careful not to brush hers. "More than sufficient. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." As they left the store together, Martha Chen watched them go with the expression of someone who recognized the beginning of something significant. She had seen enough of life to know that sometimes the most important partnerships were born from mutual need, and that the strongest bonds were often forged between people who had nowhere else to turn. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street. Sarah walked beside Jake, acutely aware of his presence, the way he matched his longer stride to hers, the careful distance he maintained that spoke of respect rather than indifference. They passed the blacksmith's shop, where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm, and the barber shop, where old men gathered to argue about politics and weather with equal passion. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said as they reached the boarding house, a two-story structure that had seen better days, but still maintained a veneer of respectability. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you planning to stay in Cedar Falls long?" "Oh, term." Sarah paused at the front steps, her hand on the weathered railing. It was a reasonable question, but one that highlighted just how uncertain her future had become. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "I came here looking for family, but it seems my late husband's information was outdated. For now, I'm taking things one day at a time." Jake nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "That's about all any of us can do, I suppose." There was something in his tone that invited confidence, a suggestion that he too was familiar with the particular uncertainty that came from having no clear path forward. Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as hardship, the firm set of his jaw that suggested a man who had once been accustomed to command. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "forgive me if this is presumptuous, but you don't strike me as someone who has always been in reduced circumstances." A ghost of a smile crossed Jake's features. "You're very observant, Mrs. Whitmore. No, I haven't always been the man you found behind that barn, but that's a story for another time, perhaps." As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Henley appeared in the doorway, her thin face set in lines of permanent disapproval. Eleanor Henley was the kind of woman who wore respectability like armor, her grey hair pinned so severely it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, her black dress buttoned to the throat, regardless of the weather. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said without preamble, "I trust you remember our conversation about the rent." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to have her financial difficulties aired in front of Jake. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping to discuss the possibility of a brief extension." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Mrs. Henley interrupted, her gaze flicking dismissively over Jake. "I have other prospective tenants who can pay promptly. You have until tomorrow evening to settle your account, or you'll need to find other accommodations." The ultimatum hung in the air like a physical weight. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with panic barely held in check. Tomorrow evening. Where could she possibly go with winter approaching and a baby on the way? Jake stepped forward slightly, his voice carefully respectful, but carrying an undertone of steel. "Ma'am, surely a woman in Mrs. Whitmore's condition deserves some consideration. Perhaps there's some work she could do to offset the debt." Mrs. Henley's expression grew even more pinched. "I don't believe I asked for your opinion, Mr. Morrison, and I'd suggest you worry about your own reputation before concerning yourself with others." The dismissal was cutting, designed to remind Jake of whatever scandal had brought him low. Sarah watched his hands clench briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax, his face carefully blank. "Of course, ma'am. I apologize for the presumption." As Mrs. Henley retreated into the boarding house with a slam of the screen door, Sarah and Jake stood in the sudden quiet, both absorbing the implications of what had just occurred. Sarah's mind raced, calculating and recalculating her limited options. She had perhaps $3 to her name, nowhere near enough for another month's rent, even if she could find someone willing to take her in. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jake said quietly, "I may know of a place where you could stay temporarily. It's not much, but it would be warm and safe until you can figure out your next step." Sarah looked at him sharply, hope and wariness warring in her expression. "What kind of place?" "An old homestead about 3 miles outside of town. The family moved on last spring, but the cabin is still sound. I've been keeping an eye on it." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "It's not fancy, but it has a good roof and a working fireplace, and it wouldn't cost you anything but the effort to get there." The offer was generous, suspiciously so, perhaps, but as Sarah considered her alternatives, she realized she had very few. Mrs. Patterson might take her in temporarily, but the old woman was barely managing on her own. The church might offer charity, but that would mean submitting to the judgment and interference of the congregation, something Sarah's pride rebelled against. "Why would you help me?" she asked directly. "We barely know each other." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. "Because I know what it's like to have nowhere to turn," he said simply, "and because sometimes the only thing that keeps us human is the chance to help someone else when we can." Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of ulterior motive or false charity. What she saw instead was a man who had been broken by circumstances and rebuilt himself into something different, not harder necessarily, but more aware of the fragility that connected all struggling souls. "I would need to see the place first," she said finally, "and I'd want to contribute somehow. I'm not looking for a handout." Jake nodded, relief flickering briefly in his eyes. "Of course, we could ride out there tomorrow morning if you'd like. And as for contributing, well, I suspect we could both benefit from sharing the work of making a place livable." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the possibility of hope. It was fragile, uncertain, built on the kindness of a stranger who had his own reasons for helping. But it was something, and in her current circumstances, something was more than she had dared to expect. The sound of Mrs. Henley's voice calling her name from inside the boarding house broke the moment, but as Sarah turned to go, she found herself looking back at Jake Morrison with something approaching gratitude. "Tomorrow morning, then," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he agreed, and tipped his hat as she climbed the steps. As the door closed behind her, Jake remained on the street for a moment longer, watching the warm light spill from the boarding house windows. For the first time in months, he had something to look forward to beyond simple survival. It wasn't much, just the chance to help someone who needed it, and perhaps to prove to himself that he was still capable of being the man he had once been. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant promise of winter, but Jake Morrison found himself walking back toward his makeshift camp with something that felt dangerously close to purpose. The morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Sarah had spent the night staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her, the creak of floorboards as other tenants moved about, the distant murmur of conversation from the parlor. Below, the whistle of wind through gaps in the window frame that spoke of the harsh winter to come. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the gentle movements of the child within, and she wondered what kind of world she was bringing this baby into. She had packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag and a small trunk, items that represented the sum total of her life with Thomas and the fragments of the life she was trying to build without him. The wedding dress carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a daguerreotype of her parents, Thomas's last letter written just days before his death, and the recipe book her mother had given her before she married. These were the treasures that defined her, the tangible pieces of a history that seemed increasingly distant from her current reality. At precisely 8 o'clock, as promised, Jake Morrison appeared at the front door of the boarding house. Sarah watched from her window as he spoke, briefly with Mrs. Henley, his hat in his hands, his manner respectful but firm. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in the older woman's posture, the way she gestured dismissively before disappearing back into the house. When the knock came at her door, Sarah was ready. She opened it to find Jake standing in the narrow hallway, looking somehow more substantial than he had the day before. He had found clean clothes somewhere, a blue work shirt that brought out his eyes, trousers that fit properly, boots that had been polished to a dull shine. The transformation was remarkable, revealing the man he must have been before whatever circumstances had reduced him to scavenging for rotten apples. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Are you ready to see the homestead?" Sarah nodded, lifting her carpet bag. Jake immediately stepped forward to take it, his gesture so natural it spoke of upbringing that went deeper than his recent hardships. As they descended the stairs together, Mrs. Henley appeared in the doorway of the parlor, her thin lips pressed. into a line of disapproval. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the confined space, "I trust you understand that your rent is still due by this evening, regardless of whatever arrangements you might be making." The emphasis she placed on the word arrangements was loaded with implications that made Sarah's cheeks burn. Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level as he addressed the landlady. "Mrs. Henley, I'm sure Mrs. Whitmore appreciates your concern for propriety. We're simply looking at housing options that might be more suitable for her situation." "Housing options," Mrs. Henley repeated, her tone suggesting she doubted the innocent nature of such arrangements. "How convenient. I do hope you'll both remember that reputations once lost are extremely difficult to recover." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt the familiar anger that came from being reduced to gossip and speculation. But before she could respond, Jake placed a gentle hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the door. "Thank you for your concern, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Henley with a courtesy that somehow managed to be more cutting than any direct confrontation. "We'll be sure to keep your advice in mind." Outside, the autumn air was crisp, with the promise of the winter that loomed just weeks away. Jake had arranged to borrow a wagon from Martha Chen, a sturdy conveyance pulled by a placid mare named Buttercup, who seemed well suited to the careful pace necessary for a pregnant woman's comfort. As they left Cedar Falls behind, the landscape opened into rolling hills, covered with golden grass that moved like ocean waves in the constant wind. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow, and Sarah found herself struck by the terrible beauty of the country, its capacity for both nurture and destruction existing side by side. "Tell me about this place." "We're going to," she said, as the wagon wheels found their rhythm on the rutted road. Jake was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. "The Hendersons built it about 5 years ago," he said finally. "Good people, but they had a run of bad luck. Crop failures, illness, and then old Henrik hurt his back something fierce. They decided to move back east to be near their daughter's family." He paused, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "I helped them with the harvest last spring before they left. Henrik asked me to keep an eye on the place, maybe find someone who could make good use of it." There was something in his tone that suggested more to the story, but Sarah didn't press. Everyone in the territory carried histories they preferred not to examine too closely, and she had learned that the kindest thing was often to accept what people chose to share without demanding more. The homestead appeared as they crested a low hill, nestled in a valley where a small creek meandered between stands of cottonwood and pine. The cabin was solidly built of logs, chinked with clay and moss, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true against the sky. A small barn stood nearby, its doors hanging open to reveal the emptiness within, and behind it the remnants of a garden that had been carefully tended but was now returning to wilderness. Sarah climbed down from the wagon with Jake's assistance, her hand lingering in his longer than strictly necessary as she found her balance. The silence of the place was profound. No sounds of human activity, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something about the homestead that spoke of hope and hard work, of dreams that had been temporarily deferred rather than permanently abandoned. Jake led her to the cabin, producing a key from his pocket. "Henrik left this with me," he explained as he unlocked the door. "Said he hoped someone would make the place live again." The interior was simple but well designed, a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area and sitting room, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a ladder leading to a sleeping loft above. The furniture was basic but sturdy. A table and chairs that Henrik had clearly made himself, shelves for dishes and supplies, a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace where one could sit and watch the flames dance. Sarah moved through the space slowly, her trained eye noting the details that spoke of careful construction and loving maintenance. The chinking between the logs was tight and even. The floors were level and well sealed, and the windows, though small, were positioned to take advantage of the best light throughout the day. "There's a well just behind the house," Jake said, watching her exploration with something that might have been anxiety. "Water's sweet and cold, and it's never gone dry, according to Henrik. The barn's in good shape too, and there's enough firewood stacked to last most of the winter." Sarah climbed the ladder to examine the loft, finding a space that was larger than it appeared from below, with a dormer window that looked out over the valley. The previous occupants had left a bed frame and a chest of drawers, and Sarah could easily imagine making a nursery in one corner where the baby would be safe and warm. When she climbed back down, she found Jake standing uncertainly by the door, his hat in his hands again. The gesture was becoming familiar, and Sarah realized it was his way of managing nervousness or uncertainty. "What do you think?" he asked. Sarah looked around the cabin again, seeing not just what it was, but what it could become. A place where she could wait out the winter safely, where her child could be born in peace, where she might have time to figure out her next step without the pressure of daily survival overwhelming her planning. "I think it's perfect," she said. "But I have to ask, what would this arrangement be exactly? I meant what I said about not wanting charity." Jake relaxed slightly, his relief evident. "Well, the place needs work to be ready for winter. The chimney could use cleaning. Some of the chinking needs to be redone, and the garden should be cleared and prepared for spring planting. I was thinking I could help with the heavy work, and you could handle the domestic arrangements. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." It was a reasonable division of labor, but Sarah sensed there was more to his offer than simple practicality. "And where would you be staying during this arrangement?" "The barn," Jake said quickly. "It's got a good loft, and I can make it comfortable enough. We'd be sharing the work and the protection, but you'd have your privacy and your reputation." The thoughtfulness of the arrangement touched her more than she cared to admit. Jake had clearly considered not just her immediate needs, but the social implications of their partnership, the way it would appear to others, and the importance of maintaining the appearance of propriety even in desperate circumstances. But as she considered his proposal, a new thought occurred to her, one that was both practical and unsettling. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "forgive me for being direct, but why haven't you been staying here already? If Henrik asked you to watch the place, surely he wouldn't have minded you making use of it yourself." Jake's expression grew shuttered, and Sarah could see him weighing how much to reveal. "There are people in town who might not appreciate my being this close to their properties," he said finally. "My presence here alone wouldn't cause problems, but if word got around—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Whatever had happened to bring Jake Morrison low, it was serious enough that his proximity to decent folk was considered a liability. The realization should have given her pause, should have made her reconsider the wisdom of isolating herself with a man whose past was clearly troubled. Instead, she found herself thinking of the gentleness with which he had offered her bread behind the barn, the careful way he had helped her into and out of the wagon, the respect he had shown her, even when Mrs. Henley was all but accusing them of impropriety. Whatever Jake Morrison had done or been accused of doing, it didn't align with the man she was coming to know. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady, "I think your proposal is both generous and practical. But I need you to understand that if we're going to do this, we do it as partners. I won't be your charity case, and you won't be mine. We both work, we both contribute, and we both benefit." "Agreed?" Jake's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness she had seen from him, transforming his face in a way that gave her a glimpse of the man he must have been before hardship carved lines around his eyes. "Agreed, Mrs. Whitmore, partners." As they shook hands on the deal, standing in the doorway of what would become their temporary home, neither of them could have anticipated how that simple word, partners, would come to define not just their living arrangement, but the foundation of something neither had dared to hope for The die was cast. Tomorrow, Sarah would gather her belongings and leave the boarding house behind. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of making the Henderson homestead livable for the winter. And tomorrow, whether they knew it or not, they would take the first real step toward healing the wounds that had brought them both to this moment of desperate partnership. But first, they had to survive Mrs. Henley's reaction to Sarah's decision, and the inevitable gossip that would follow a pregnant widow's choice to share a homestead with the most notorious man in Cedar Falls. The Henderson homestead transformed in the space of a week, taking on the lived-in quality that only comes when people invest their hopes as well as their labor in a place. Sarah had moved her belongings from the boarding house under the disapproving gaze of Mrs. Henley and half the town, but she carried herself with a dignity that discouraged the worst of the gossip. Jake had been true to his word about the barn, creating a surprisingly comfortable living space in the loft, complete with a small stove he had somehow acquired and installed. Their days fell into a rhythm that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. Jake would rise before dawn to tend to the animals. He had managed to trade work for a milk cow and some chickens, and to begin whatever heavy labor the day required. Sarah would wake to the sound of his movements and the comforting crackle of the fire he always had burning in the main cabin before she stirred. They would share breakfast in companionable quiet, planning the day's work over coffee that Jake somehow managed to make stronger and more satisfying than any she had tasted. The division of labor worked exactly as they had planned, but Sarah found herself surprised by Jake's capabilities beyond simple manual work. He approached each task with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to responsibility, whether he was repairing loose chinking between the cabin logs or carefully cleaning the chimney to ensure proper draw for the fireplace. His hands, she noticed, were those of a man who had known both hard work and authority, calloused from labor, but with the long fingers and careful movements of someone educated in more than just survival. It was while watching him work on the chimney that Sarah first glimpsed the depth of what Jake Morrison had lost. He was balanced on a ladder that he had braced carefully against the cabin wall, methodically removing years of accumulated soot and bird nests from the flue. The work was dirty and demanding, requiring him to reach deep into the narrow space with tools he had fashioned himself. "Hand me that wire brush, would you?" he called down to her, and as Sarah passed it up, she noticed something glinting in the toolbox he had brought from town. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "is that a pocket watch?" Jake's movement stilled for a moment before he continued his work. "Was," he said finally, "belonged to my father." Sarah looked more closely and realized what she was seeing. The watch was displayed behind glass, in the window of Patterson's Pawn and Mercantile, its gold case catching the afternoon light. She had walked past it dozens of times during her trips to town, never thinking to wonder about its history or the circumstances that had brought it there. "That's your father's watch in Patterson's window," she said, understanding flooding through her. Jake climbed down from the ladder, his face carefully composed, but his hands trembling slightly as he cleaned the soot from his fingers with a rag. Among other things, yes. The simple admission carried the weight of a much larger story, and Sarah felt her heart constrict with sympathy for whatever series of disasters had forced Jake Morrison to sell his father's watch. She had pawned her own wedding ring twice during the worst of Thomas's illness, understanding all too well the particular shame that came with trading family treasures for basic survival. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "Your father." Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful control of someone accessing painful memories. "Samuel Morrison was the finest man I ever knew," he said, settling onto the cabin's front step and gesturing for Sarah to join him. "He came to Wyoming in the early days, when it was still dangerous to be this far from civilization. Built a ranch about 20 miles north of here, raised cattle and horses, and somehow managed to make it profitable even in the worst years." Sarah lowered herself carefully beside him, noting the way Jake's eyes focused on some distant point. as he spoke, as if he were seeing his father's ranch instead of the Henderson homestead. He taught me everything: how to read the weather, how to judge horseflesh, how to manage men without breaking their spirits. But more than that, he taught me about honor, about keeping your word even when it costs you, about standing up for what's right, even when it's easier to look the other way. "What happened to the ranch?" Sarah asked gently. Jake's laugh was bitter. "Drought hit us hard 3 years running, then rustlers started working the area, and we lost most of our remaining stock. But took a loan from the bank to keep us going, using the ranch as collateral." He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. "When he died of pneumonia that winter, I inherited the debt along with the land. I tried to make it work, but without capital to rebuild the herd, he didn't need to finish." Sarah understood the mathematics of frontier failure all too well, how quickly circumstances could spiral beyond any individual's ability to control them, how easily a life's work could be lost to forces larger than personal determination or moral character. "The bank foreclosed," she said, "eventually, but before that happened I took a job as foreman on the Webb Ranch. Marcus Webb offered good wages and a chance to earn enough to pay down the debt. I thought if I could just buy some time." Jake's voice trailed off, and Sarah sensed they were approaching the heart of whatever had brought him to his current circumstances. She waited patiently, understanding that some stories could only be told at their own pace. "There were problems at the Webb Ranch," Jake continued finally. "Cattle disappearing, books that didn't add up, men asking questions about where certain herds had come from. I started noticing things that didn't make sense, and when I tried to bring my concerns to Webb, he didn't want to hear them," Sarah guessed. "Worse than that, he accused me of being the one behind the thefts. Said I was using my position to cover my own rustling operation." Jake's voice was flat now, drained of emotion. "Had the sheriff arrest me, claiming they'd found stolen cattle on what was left of my father's land." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "But surely you could prove your innocence?" "Hard to prove a negative, especially when the evidence was planted by the same people who were supposed to investigate the crime. I spent 2 months in jail before a judge finally dismissed the charges for lack of evidence, but by then the damage was done. No one wanted to hire a suspected rustler, and the bank had already taken the ranch to cover the legal fees." The scope of Jake's fall became clear to Sarah in that moment. Not just the loss of property and position, but the destruction of reputation and identity that had followed. She understood now why he had been reduced to scavenging behind barns, why the townspeople treated him with suspicion, why he had been so careful about the propriety of their living arrangement. "That's why you've been living rough," she said. Jake nodded. "Been doing odd jobs where I could find them, staying away from town mostly. The work you offered me was the first regular employment I'd had since the trial." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing not just the information, but the trust Jake had shown in sharing it with her. She thought about her own assumptions when she had first encountered him, how easy it would have been to dismiss him as simply another frontier casualty, without considering the complex series of events that had brought him to that point. "Mr. Morrison," she said finally, "I want you to know that nothing you've told me changes my opinion of our partnership. If anything, it makes me more grateful for your willingness to help me when you had every reason to focus on your own troubles." Jake turned to look at her directly for the first time since beginning his story, and Sarah saw surprise in his eyes, as if he had expected judgment rather than acceptance. "You don't think I'm a fool for trusting the wrong people, for not seeing what was happening until it was too late. I think you're a man who was raised to believe in honor and fairness, and who found himself dealing with people who understood neither. That's not foolishness, that's decency." Sarah shifted slightly to face him more fully. "Besides, we all have to trust someone eventually. The trick is learning to tell the difference between people who deserve it and people who don't. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats on the road drew their attention. A rider was approaching the homestead, and as the figure drew closer, Sarah recognized Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived nearest to them. The old woman's arrival was unexpected enough to put both Sarah and Jake on guard. Visitors were rare this far from town, and unannounced visits usually meant either emergency or trouble. Mrs. Patterson dismounted with the spry efficiency of someone who had been riding horses longer than most people had been alive. She was a small woman, weathered by decades of frontier life, but possessed of the kind of wiry strength that seemed to grow more formidable with age. Her grey hair was braided and pinned beneath a practical hat, and her riding skirt was divided, in the style that shocked Eastern sensibilities but made perfect sense for a woman who valued function over fashion. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Morrison," she said, approaching the cabin with the direct manner that characterized most long-time residents of the territory. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to see how you were settling in." "Not at all." "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, rising to greet their visitor. "Would you like some coffee? I was just about to put a fresh pot on." "That sounds lovely, dear. And perhaps Mr. Morrison wouldn't mind taking a look at my mare's left front hoof while I'm here. She's been favoring it slightly, and I'd value a second opinion." As Jake moved to examine the horse, Sarah busied herself with the coffee, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Patterson's visit was about more than neighborly courtesy and veterinary advice. The old woman's eyes were too sharp, her casual questions about their arrangements too carefully phrased, her timing too convenient, given the conversation she had just interrupted. Whatever Mrs. Patterson's true purpose, Sarah had the distinct impression that their quiet domestic experiment was about to become considerably more complicated. Mrs. Patterson accepted her coffee with the gracious efficiency of someone accustomed to frontier hospitality, settling into Henderson's old rocking chair as if she belonged there, her weathered hands wrapped around the tin cup with obvious appreciation, and she sipped the hot liquid with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned to savor life's simple pleasures. "This is excellent coffee," she said to Sarah. "You have a gift for making the most of basic provisions." "Thank you," Sarah replied, settling into one of the straight-backed chairs Jake had repaired. "Though I can't take all the credit, Mr. Morrison seems to have a talent for acquiring quality supplies even on a limited budget." Through the window, they could see Jake examining Mrs. Patterson's mare with the careful attention of someone who understood horses. He ran his hands along the animal's leg with professional competence, speaking to her in the low, soothing tones that calmed even the most nervous livestock. "He knows his way around animals," Mrs. Patterson observed, following Sarah's gaze. "Always, even as a boy. Samuel Morrison raised that young man right, taught him to respect living things and treat them with kindness." The comment was clearly intended to convey more than simple observation, and Sarah found herself studying the older woman's face for clues about her true purpose in visiting. Mrs. Patterson had the kind of weathered features that made age difficult to determine, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had survived decades on the frontier by understanding people as well as she understood weather and livestock. "You knew Mr. Morrison's father?" Sarah asked. "Knew Samuel for nigh on 20 years. He was one of the first settlers in this valley, back when the Cheyennes still considered this their hunting ground. Good man, fair dealer, never cheated anyone. Out of so much as a penny." Mrs. Patterson paused, her gaze growing distant. "It broke his heart when folks started believing those lies about Jake being a rustler." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "Mr. Morrison mentioned that his father died before the worst of the trouble. Pneumonia took Samuel the winter before the accusations started flying. But he knew something was wrong." Jake tried to keep the worst of his worries from the old man, but Samuel wasn't a fool. He could see his son was troubled about something at the Webb Ranch. Mrs. Patterson set down her coffee cup and leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the confidential tone reserved for sharing important truths. There's things going on in this valley that decent people don't like to talk about, Mrs. Whitmore. Things that have been festering for years while good folks looked the other way because it was easier than asking hard questions. Before Sarah could respond, Jake appeared in the doorway, his examination of the mare complete. "She's got a stone bruise on her left fore," he reported to Mrs. Patterson. "Nothing serious, but she should be rested for a few days and have the hoof soaked in warm salt water twice daily." "I thought it might be something like that," Mrs. Patterson said, rising from the rocking chair with the fluid motion of someone who had spent her life in constant movement. "Thank you for the diagnosis, Jake. I'll take your advice." As Mrs. Patterson prepared to leave, she paused at the door and fixed both Sarah and Jake with a steady look that seemed to convey more than her words. "You two have found yourselves a good arrangement here," she said. "The Henderson place has been lonely too long, and it's good to see it lived in again. I hope you'll both remember that good neighbors look out for each other, especially when times get difficult." After Mrs. Patterson had ridden away, Sarah and Jake found themselves standing in the yard, both sensing that the visit had been about more than neighborly courtesy or veterinary consultation. "She knows something," Sarah said quietly. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Patterson has lived in this valley longer than almost anyone. If there's trouble brewing, she'd be one of the first to sense it." That evening, as they settled into their routine of shared supper and quiet conversation, Sarah found herself thinking about the undercurrents she had sensed in Mrs. Patterson's visit. The older woman's comments about things that decent people didn't like to discuss, her careful praise of Jake's character, her pointed remarks about neighbors looking out for each other, all of it suggested a complexity to their situation that Sarah was only beginning to understand. "Mr. Morrison," she said as Jake banked the fire for the night, "would you be willing to teach me to read better?" Jake paused in his work, turning to look at her with surprise. "I thought you read quite well already." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I can manage simple things, household accounts, basic correspondence, but Thomas used to handle anything more complicated, and I've realized there are gaps in my education that could be problematic." What she didn't say was that Mrs. Patterson's veiled warnings had made her acutely aware of how vulnerable her ignorance might make her. If there truly were dangerous undercurrents in the valley's politics and business dealings, she needed to be able to understand documents, contracts, and legal papers well enough to protect herself and her child. Jake studied her face for a moment, and Sarah had the impression that he understood her unspoken concerns. "Of course," he said finally. "What would you like to start with?" Sarah reached for the item she treasured most among her possessions, a leather-bound book with pages yellowed by age and use. Her mother's recipe collection, written in careful script that documented not just ingredients and methods, but family history and domestic wisdom accumulated over generations. "My mother's recipes," she said, offering the book to Jake. "It seems fitting somehow, learning from something that represents home and family." Jake accepted the book with the reverence due a precious artifact, opening it carefully to reveal pages covered with neat handwriting. But as he began to read, Sarah noticed something that surprised her. His brow furrowed slightly, and he held the book closer to the lamplight, as if struggling to make out the words. "The light isn't very good," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested the problem wasn't entirely with the illumination. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said gently, "when did you last read something?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the book's pages. "It's been a while," he admitted finally. "Since before the trouble started, really. Haven't had much call for reading when you're focused on just surviving day to day." Sarah felt a wave of understanding wash over her. She had assumed that Jake's education was more advanced than her own, but she was beginning to realize that his current circumstances had taken a toll on more than just his physical and financial well-being. Skills unused tended to atrophy, and the stress of survival could crowd out the mental exercises that kept one sharp. "Then we can learn together," she said, You can help me with the words I don't understand, and I can help you practice reading aloud." Jake's smile was slow but genuine. "That sounds like a fair arrangement." As they settled into their first lesson, Sarah reading aloud from her mother's recipe for apple cake while Jake followed along, she found herself thinking about the different kinds of partnership that were possible between two people. There was the practical arrangement they had begun with, shared labor and mutual protection. But there was also this, the deeper intimacy of shared vulnerability, of admitting ignorance and accepting help without shame. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Winter was coming, bringing with it the isolation that would either strengthen their partnership or reveal its weaknesses. But for now, in the warm circle of lamplight, with Jake's quiet voice joining hers as they worked through her mother's careful instructions for creating something sweet from simple ingredients, Sarah felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The baby moved within her, a gentle flutter that reminded her of all she had to protect and hope for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, and perhaps new complications from whatever was troubling Mrs. Patterson. But tonight she had a warm home, a reliable partner, and the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to happiness. As Jake helped her to her feet and wished her good night, their hands touched briefly over the recipe book, and Sarah felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with friendship or practical partnership. The realization should have alarmed her, but instead it felt like another kind of beginning, one that she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely, but couldn't entirely ignore either. The sound of careful carving filled the barn in the early morning hours when Jake thought Sarah was still asleep. He had risen before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of beginning the day's regular chores, he had climbed to his loft and retrieved a piece of pine he had been secretly working on for the past 2 weeks. The wood was taking shape under his hands, transforming from a rough plank into something recognizably purposeful. The curved headboard was nearly complete, carved with a simple pattern of leaves and vines that spoke of life and growth rather than the harsh pragmatism that characterized most frontier furniture. Each cut was deliberate, each curve smoothed. With sandpaper he had traded for in town, each detail considered with the kind of care that went beyond mere functionality. Jake paused in his work, holding up the piece to examine it in the pale light filtering through the barn's small window. The cradle was becoming something beautiful, not ornate or ostentatious, but possessed of the quiet grace that came from honest craftsmanship and genuine intention. It would be sturdy enough to last through multiple children, beautiful enough to become a family heirloom, and made with enough love to serve as a tangible promise of the future he hoped to help create. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months ago, he had been a man with nothing to offer anyone, reduced to scavenging for survival and sleeping in whatever shelter he could find. Now he was crafting furniture for a child that wasn't his, planning for a future that might not include him, investing hope and labor in the possibility that Sarah Whitmore might allow him to be part of whatever family she was building. That's beautiful work. Jake turned to find Sarah standing at the bottom of the ladder, wrapped in her shawl against the morning chill. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and there was something in her expression that suggested she had been watching him work for longer than he realized. "I hope you don't mind," he said, setting down his carving tools. "I know we never discussed it, but I thought the baby would need—" "I don't mind," Sarah interrupted softly. "I'm grateful. It's the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Jake climbed down from the loft, bringing the partially completed cradle with him. In the better light of the barn's main floor, Sarah could see the full scope of his work, not just the headboard he had been carving, but the rockers and side panels that were already assembled, the mattress support that had been fitted and sanded smooth, the tiny details that spoke of painstaking attention to both beauty and function. "You're incredibly skilled," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "This is the work of a master craftsman." Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at her praise. My father taught me. He believed a man should be able to work, with his hands as well as his head, that there was dignity in creating something that would outlast its maker. He was right, Sarah said, her voice carrying an emotion that made Jake look at her more closely. This cradle will be treasured long after both of us are gone. The baby will sleep in it, and someday their children will sleep in it, and it will carry the story of the kindness that created it. The way she spoke of the future, their shared future, it seemed, made something tighten in Jake's chest. He had been careful not to assume too much about their arrangement, to respect the boundaries of their partnership without pressing for more than Sarah was willing to give. But there were moments like this, when her words suggested possibilities that he hardly dared to hope for. "Sarah," he said, then stopped, realizing he had used her given name without permission. "Mrs. Whitmore, I mean. I apologize. Sarah is fine," she said quietly. "I think we've moved beyond such formality, don't you?" The simple permission felt like a gift greater than any he had ever received. To be allowed to speak her name, to move from the careful distance of Mrs. Whitmore to the intimacy of Sarah, it represented a shift in their relationship that went far beyond mere convenience or necessity. "Sarah," he said again, savoring the feel of her name on his tongue. "There's something I need to tell you, something you should know before..." Before what? Before the baby was born? Before winter trapped them together in closer quarters? Before whatever was building between them progressed to something that couldn't be easily undone? "What is it, Jake?" she asked, and the sound of his name in her voice was like music. Jake set the cradle carefully aside and moved to the barn's window, looking out over the valley that had become their shared home. The autumn colors were reaching their peak, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would soon give way to the stark beauty of winter. It was a view that never failed to stir something in him, a reminder of why men and women chose to make lives in such unforgiving country despite all the hardships it entailed. "There's been talk in town," he said finally, "about us, about our arrangement here. Most of it's harmless enough, folks wondering how long we'll last, whether we're properly married or just playing house. But some of it's more troubling." Sarah joined him at the window, her presence beside him both comforting and unsettling. "What kind of talk?" "Marcus Webb has been asking questions about why I'm here, about what you might know regarding your late husband's business dealings. He's been subtle about it, but Martha Chen mentioned it when I was in town for supplies last week." The mention of Webb's name caused Sarah's expression to tighten. She had heard enough about Jake's former employer to understand that his interest in their affairs was unlikely to be benign. "What kind of business dealings?" she asked. Jake turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. Thomas worked for several ranches in the area before he died, including some seasonal work for Webb. It's possible he saw or heard something that made certain people nervous." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her belly, where the baby stirred restlessly. "You think Thomas's death might not have been an accident? It wasn't a question." And Jake found himself impressed once again by Sarah's quick intelligence and willingness to confront difficult truths. Many women in her position would have shied away from such implications, preferred the comfort of believing their husband's death was simply a tragedy rather than something more sinister. "I think it's possible," Jake said carefully. "A tree doesn't usually fall on the most experienced woodsman in the territory unless something causes it to fall. And now Webb is interested in me because he thinks Thomas might have told me something before he died. That would be my guess, yes." Sarah absorbed this information with the steady calm that Jake had come to admire in her. She didn't panic or demand immediate action, but he could see her mind working through the implications and possibilities with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to solving problems. "What do you recommend we do?" she asked. The simple question, asked without hysteria or blame, highlighted the partnership they had built over the past weeks. She wasn't asking him to fix everything or take complete responsibility for their safety. She was asking for his assessment and advice, trusting him to help her think through their options without expecting him to make decisions for her. "We stay alert," Jake said. "We don't change our routine dramatically enough to suggest we know something's wrong, but we pay attention to who's watching us and who's asking questions. And we make sure you're never alone and unprotected, especially as the baby's time gets closer." "And we finish the cradle," Sarah added with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "If we're going to face whatever's coming, we might as well do it with hope for the future." Jake felt his heart constrict with affection for this woman who could find reasons for optimism even when discussing threats to her safety. The cradle suddenly seemed less like a simple piece of furniture and more like a declaration of faith. Faith in tomorrow, faith in their ability to protect what they were building together, faith in the possibility that love could triumph over the forces that sought to destroy it. "We finished the cradle," he agreed, and reached out to take her hand. The touch was brief, but it carried the weight of promises neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The man who had been broken by false accusations and the woman who had been widowed by suspicious circumstances would stand against whatever forces had destroyed their separate pasts, united now by something stronger than convenience or necessity. They would stand together, and perhaps if they were very lucky and very strong, they would build something beautiful enough to last. Sarah discovered the letters on a crisp October morning while organizing the small trunk that contained her most precious possessions. She'd been looking for her mother's thimble, planning to spend the afternoon mending Jake's work shirts, when her fingers encountered a bundle she had forgotten existed. Correspondence from Thomas during their brief courtship, tied with a faded blue ribbon that had once matched her favorite dress. The letters had been a source of comfort in the early days of her widowhood, tangible reminders of Thomas's love and their shared dreams. But as the weeks had passed, and survival had demanded her full attention, she had packed them away, unable to bear the weight of what they represented. Now, settling into her new life at the Henderson homestead, she found herself ready to revisit those memories without being overwhelmed by grief. She carried the bundle to the kitchen table, where the morning light would allow her to read Thomas's careful script. Jake was working in the barn, putting the finishing touches on the cradle that had become his obsession, and she had the cabin to herself for this private communion with her past. The first few letters were exactly as she remembered. Sweet declarations of affection, plans for their wedding, descriptions of the land he hoped to claim for their future home. Thomas's voice came through clearly in the careful phrases, his optimism and determination evident in every line. Reading them now, Sarah could almost hear his voice, remember the shy smile that had accompanied his more romantic declarations. But as she progressed through the chronological sequence, she noticed a change in tone that she hadn't perceived during her first readings. The later letters, written after their marriage when Thomas was working for various ranchers, while they saved money for their own homestead, carried an undercurrent of worry that had nothing to do with their personal finances or future plans. "The work here is steady," Thomas had written from the web ranch, "but I confess myself troubled by certain irregularities in the operation. Mr. Webb is generous with wages, perhaps more generous than the ranch's legitimate profits would seem to warrant. I have resolved to keep my observations to myself, as speculation serves no useful purpose, but I cannot shake the feeling that I am witnessing something that decent men should not ignore." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn, air seeping through the cabin's windows. She read the passage again, then continued through the remaining letters with growing unease. Thomas's concerns had clearly deepened over time, though he had been careful to avoid specific accusations or details that might compromise his position. My beloved Sarah, read another passage, I find myself in a delicate situation regarding my employment. I have observed certain activities that seem inconsistent with proper ranching practices, and I fear I may have been too obvious in my interest. Mr. Webb has begun asking pointed questions about my background and my intentions. Regarding our future in the territory, I believe it may be wise to seek employment elsewhere, though I'm reluctant to leave without understanding the full scope of what I have witnessed. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death, was the most troubling of all. His handwriting, usually so careful and precise, showed signs of haste and stress. Dearest wife, I write this in great urgency, as I believe my situation has become dangerous. I have discovered evidence of a systematic operation involving stolen cattle and falsified records, reaching higher into the territory's power structure than I had imagined. I have attempted to document what I have learned, but I fear my activities have been noted by those I seek to expose. If anything should happen to me, know that I have hidden certain papers that could prove valuable to honest law enforcement. Look for them where we first spoke of building our dream house. You will remember the old oak with the heart carved in its trunk. I pray I am being overly cautious, but I needed you to know, should circumstances make it necessary for you to seek justice for crimes I lack the courage to confront alone. Sarah's hands trembled as she finished reading. The letter explained so much. Thomas's increased nervousness in his final weeks, his cryptic comments about being careful whom they trusted, his sudden decision to begin clearing land for their homestead rather than continuing his work for wages. He had been preparing to leave ranching employment behind, but he had been too late. The sound of Jake's footsteps on the cabin's front steps made her quickly gather the letters together, retying them with their ribbon. She needed time to process what she had learned, to consider the implications before sharing this information with anyone, even Jake, whose trustworthiness she no longer questioned, but whose safety she wouldn't compromise unnecessarily. "Good morning," Jake said as he entered, his clothes dusty from his work in the barn. "I think the cradle is finally finished. Would you like to see it?" Sarah managed a smile that she hoped appeared natural. "Of course, I've been looking forward to it." But as they walked to the barn together, Sarah's mind was racing with possibilities and dangers. If Thomas had indeed hidden evidence of criminal activity, and if the people he had been investigating were responsible for his death, then her very existence represented a threat to them. Jake's warnings about Marcus Webb's interest suddenly took on new urgency, and she realized that their peaceful weeks at the homestead might have been nothing more than the calm before a very dangerous storm. The cradle was indeed beautiful, crafted with the kind of care that spoke of deep affection and hope for the future. Jake had carved a simple border of roses along the headboard, a detail that caught Sarah completely off guard, as she had never mentioned her love for the flowers that had grown in her mother's garden back in Missouri. "How did you know?" she asked, tracing the delicate petals with her fingertip. Jake's cheeks colored slightly. "You mentioned them once, when you were talking about your mother's garden. You got a certain look in your eyes when you spoke of the roses she grew by the kitchen window." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the attention he had paid to a casual comment made weeks ago, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Here was a man who listened not just to her words, but to the emotions behind them, who cared enough to remember what brought her joy and incorporate it into something meant to comfort her child. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it completely. "The baby will be so lucky to sleep in something made with such love." "Our baby," Jake said softly, then caught himself. "I mean, our baby," Sarah repeated, the words feeling right in a way that surprised her. "Yes, I think that's exactly what this child will be." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine fully. But as Jake helped her run her hands over the smooth wood, testing the gentle rock of the cradle's motion, Sarah felt something shift inside her. a recognition that the family she was building might include more than just herself and her child. Lucy's letters in her pocket seemed to burn with the weight of their revelations. But for this moment, standing in the warm barn, with Jake's hands covering hers as they blessed the cradle that would hold their future, Sarah allowed herself to believe that love might indeed be stronger than the forces arrayed against them. Whatever Thomas had discovered, whatever dangers his knowledge had brought into her life, she would face them with Jake beside her. They had built something worth protecting, and she was beginning to understand that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the risks involved. The baby moved within her, a strong kick that seemed to approve of the cradle's gentle motion. And Sarah smiled despite the challenges that lay ahead. Let Marcus Webb and his associates come. Let them try to destroy what she and Jake were building. They would find that a pregnant woman with nothing left to lose and a man with everything to prove made formidable opponents indeed. Sheriff Ben Hawthorne arrived at the Henderson homestead on a grey November morning when the first serious snow of the season was beginning to dust the mountains. Sarah watched from the cabin window as he dismounted from his horse, with the deliberate movements of a man who wanted his presence to be noted and respected. The badge on his coat caught what little sunlight filtered through the overcast sky, a star of authority that had once represented justice and order to the people of Cedar Falls. Jake emerged from the barn to meet the sheriff, his manner respectful but wary. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself between Hawthorne and the cabin where she waited. Whatever the sheriff's business, Jake clearly wasn't expecting it to be pleasant. "Morning, Sheriff," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat. "What brings you out this way?" Hawthorne was a large man who had grown larger over the years, his once powerful frame now running to fat, but still possessing the kind of presence that commanded attention. His mustache was perfectly groomed despite the early hour, and his clothes spoke of prosperity that seemed inconsistent with a lawman's salary. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Official business, Morrison. I've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I'm conducting interviews with all the residents." His pale eyes moved past Jake to fix on the cabin windows. "I'll need to speak with Mrs. Whitmore as well." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to move with calm dignity as she stepped onto the front porch. The letters hidden in her trunk seemed to burn in her memory, their revelations about Thomas's discoveries taking on new significance with the sheriff's unexpected visit. "Good morning, Sheriff Hawthorne," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "How can we help you?" Hawthorne removed his hat with a flourish that might have been considered gallant under different circumstances. "Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize for disturbing your morning, but I'm investigating reports of missing cattle from several area ranches. Valuable livestock has been disappearing, and we have reason to believe rustlers may be using the old mountain trails to move stolen herds." Jake's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood more about this visit than the sheriff's words revealed. "I'm afraid we haven't seen any sign of rustlers," Sarah said. "We keep to ourselves mostly, and our view of the mountain passes is limited from here." Of course," Hawthorne said, his tone suggesting he found her response perfectly reasonable. "But you understand, Mrs. Whitmore, that your situation here makes you somewhat vulnerable to approach by unsavory characters. A woman in your condition, living with a man of questionable reputation, well, it might attract the wrong sort of attention." The insult was delivered with such casual authority that it took Sarah a moment to fully process its implications. Hawthorne wasn't just investigating rustling, he was making it clear that he considered her living arrangement with Jake to be somehow connected to criminal activity. "Sheriff," Jake said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "I think you've made your point. Mrs. Whitmore is a respectable woman who deserves better than your insinuations." Hawthorne's smile was cold and calculating. Respectable women don't usually find themselves living in isolation with men like you, Morrison. Men who've already been suspected of cattle theft once. Suspected and cleared of all charges, Jake replied evenly. As you well know, cleared for lack of evidence, Hawthorne corrected. Which isn't quite the same thing as being proven innocent. Is it? Sarah stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding her caution. Sheriff Hawthorne, Mr. Morrison has been nothing but honorable in his dealings with me. If you have accusations to make, I suggest you make them plainly, rather than hiding behind innuendo. Hawthorne's attention focused on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Mrs. Whitmore, you seem very quick to defend a man you barely know. I wonder what your late husband would think of such loyalty. The mention of Thomas hit Sarah like a physical blow, but it also crystallized something that had been nagging at the edge of her consciousness since Hawthorne's arrival. Sheriff's questions weren't random. They were pointed, specific, designed to probe for particular information. My late husband, she said carefully, was a good judge of character. He taught me to recognize honor when I see it. Indeed, Hawthorne said, his pale eyes never leaving her face. Thomas Whitmore was a observant man, perhaps too observant, for his own good. The words hung in the air like a physical threat, and Sarah felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. Hawthorne's interest in her location, his pointed questions about Jake's character, his casual mention of Thomas's observational nature, none of it was coincidental. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Are you suggesting that my husband's death was something other than an accident?" Hawthorne's smile widened, but there was nothing pleasant in the expression. "I'm suggesting that accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. Mrs. Whitmore, people who stick their noses into business that doesn't concern them." Jake moved closer to Sarah, his body language shifting from wariness to active protection. "I think this conversation has gone far enough, Sheriff. Unless you have specific charges to bring or evidence to present, I'd suggest you move along. Actually, Morrison, I do have evidence to present." Hawthorne reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle rustling and conspiracy to commit theft. It seems your previous exoneration was premature." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Hawthorne wasn't investigating crime. He was orchestrating it. The badge on his chest, the symbol of law and order she had been raised to respect, was being used to protect the very criminals it should have been pursuing. "That warrant is fabricated," Jake said calmly, but his hands had moved to his sides, ready for trouble. "Just like the evidence that was planted on my father's land. Evidence that mysteriously disappeared before it could be properly catalogued," Hawthorne agreed. "But this time we've been more careful. This time the stolen cattle are hidden where they'll be found, and the bills of sale bearing your forged signature are safely in our possession." The admission was so brazen, so confident, that Sarah understood they were dealing with men who believed themselves untouchable. Hawthorne wasn't worried about witnesses because he controlled the law in Cedar Falls. He wasn't concerned about evidence because he manufactured it to suit his needs. "Why?" Sarah asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Why destroy innocent people for money?" Hawthorne's expression grew almost philosophical. "Because money is power, Mrs. Whitmore, and power is the only thing that matters in this territory. Your husband understood that eventually. Unfortunately, he also understood too much about our methods." "You killed him," Sarah said, the truth settling over her like a shroud. "I didn't kill anyone," Hawthorne replied with technical precision. "I simply ensured that certain problems were resolved. Thomas was becoming troublesome, asking questions about missing cattle, making notes about shipping records that didn't match reported sales. It was regrettable, but necessary." Jake's face had gone white with fury, but before he could act on his anger, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Marcus Webb rode into the yard, flanked by two men Sarah didn't recognize. their presence transforming the confrontation from a legal proceeding into something far more dangerous. "Sheriff," Webb said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "is there a problem here?" "No problem at all, Marcus," Hawthorne replied, "just serving a warrant on our friend Morrison. Though I suspect Mrs. Whitmore might have some information that could help us locate certain missing documents her husband may have left behind." The pieces of the conspiracy fell into place with sickening clarity. Webb, Hawthorne, and their associates had been systematically stealing cattle and falsifying records, using the sheriff's authority to cover their crimes and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them. Thomas had discovered their operation and paid for that knowledge with his life. Jake had been framed and destroyed as a potential witness, and now they were here to finish what they had started. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, drawing herself up to her full height despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I believe you've overplayed your hand." Webb's laugh was genuinely amused. "Have we, Mrs. Whitmore? You're an isolated pregnant woman, with no family, no resources, and no proof of anything beyond your own speculation. Morrison is a disgraced ranch hand with a history of accusations against him. Who exactly do you think is going to believe your word against ours?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing the danger surrounding them. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of protective fury that burned away her uncertainty. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "you should have asked me that question before confessing to murder in front of witnesses." The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the bare trees and the distant sound of snow beginning to fall more heavily. Hawthorne's face had gone pale beneath his mustache, and Webb's confident expression faltered as he realized the implications of what had just been said. They had come to the homestead expecting to find easy prey, a frightened woman and a broken man who could be disposed of without consequence. Instead, they had walked into a trap of their own making, revealing the scope of their crimes to people who now had nothing left to lose by fighting back. The war for Cedar Falls had begun, and it would be fought not in the streets of town, but in the snow-covered valley, where two people who had found love in the midst of desperation prepared to defend everything they had built together. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the soft whisper of snowflakes, beginning to fall more steadily. Webb's confident expression had transformed into something harder, more calculating, as he processed the implications of what Hawthorne had revealed. Sarah could see him weighing options, considering how much damage control would be necessary to contain the situation. "Mrs. Whitmore," Webb said finally, his voice carrying a false reasonableness that fooled no one, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Sheriff Hawthorne was simply describing hypothetical scenarios, not confessing to actual crimes." "Was he?" Sarah asked, her hand moving protectively to her belly, where the baby had begun to move restlessly. "Because it sounded very much like a detailed admission of conspiracy and murder to me." Jake stepped closer to her, his presence both comforting and protective. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the careful control of a man preparing for violence while hoping to avoid it. His eyes never left Webb and his companions, cataloguing threats and calculating odds with the precision of someone who had learned to read danger in the movement of men's hands and the positioning of their bodies. "The problem with hypothetical scenarios," Jake said quietly, "is that they have a way of becoming very real when spoken by the wrong people to the wrong audience." Hawthorne's face had flushed red beneath his carefully groomed mustache. "You're both making a serious mistake if you think anyone will believe the word of a suspected rustler and a desperate widow against respected members of the community." "Respected?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Is that what you call men who murder innocent people and frame others for their crimes? I'm curious about your definition of respect, Sheriff." One of Webb's companions, a lean man with cold eyes and scarred hands, shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Marcus," he said in a low voice, "we're wasting time here. These people know too much, and talking isn't going to fix that problem. Webb held up a hand, but his expression suggested he was beginning to agree with his associate's assessment. Mrs. Whitmore, you're obviously distraught. The stress of your condition, the isolation, the company you've been keeping, it's clearly affected your judgment. Perhaps we should arrange for you to be examined by a doctor, someone who could speak to your mental state. The threat was clear. They would declare her insane, have her committed, and dispose of both her testimony and her person through legal channels that they controlled. Jake's jaw tightened, and Sarah could see him coming to the same realization. That won't be necessary, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. My mental state is perfectly clear, and my memory of this conversation is excellent. I'm sure Mrs. Patterson would agree, given that she's been listening from the tree line for the past 10 minutes. Every head turned toward the stand of pines that bordered the homestead's eastern edge. For a moment, nothing moved except the falling snow. Then Mrs. Patterson emerged from behind a large evergreen, leading her horse and carrying what appeared to be a hunting rifle with practiced ease. "Good morning, gentlemen," the elderly woman said, her voice carrying across the yard with remarkable clarity. "I hope you don't mind my interrupting, but I was returning Sarah's pie pan and couldn't help overhearing your conversation." Webb's face had gone pale. "Mrs. Patterson, this is official law enforcement business. You should move along." "Should I?" Mrs. Patterson asked, continuing her approach with the unhurried confidence of someone who had faced down everything the frontier could throw at her. "Because it sounds to me like you gentlemen have been confessing to serious crimes, murder, conspiracy, cattle theft, quite a list of charges." "You're mistaken, ma'am," Hawthorne said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "We were discussing hypothetical situations related to ongoing investigations." Mrs. Patterson stopped within easy conversation distance, her rifle held with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. "Ben Hawthorne, I've known you since you were a boy pulling girls' pigtails behind the schoolhouse. You never were any good at lying then, and you haven't improved with age." The familiarity in her tone, the way she reduced the corrupt sheriff to the status of a misbehaving child, changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Sarah found herself suppressing an inappropriate urge to smile despite the danger they faced. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson continued, "I've been watching the comings and goings around Marcus Webb's ranch for months now. Funny how cattle seem to arrive at night and leave before dawn, always when the moon is dark and the weather is poor for traveling." Webb's composure finally cracked. "You old witch, you don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why I have detailed notes about license brands, shipping dates, and buyer information that don't match the territorial records, or why I've been in correspondence with federal marshals who are very interested in the cattle theft ring that's been operating in this region." The admission hit the group of men like a physical blow. Sarah felt Jake's hand brush against hers, a brief contact that conveyed both reassurance and readiness. The balance of power had shifted dramatically with Mrs. Patterson's revelation, but that shift also made their situation more dangerous. Cornered criminals were unpredictable, and these men had already demonstrated their willingness to kill too. "Protect their operation." "You're bluffing," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Patterson reached into her coat and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a telegram I received yesterday from Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford. He'll be arriving in Cedar Falls tomorrow morning with a federal warrant for the arrest of everyone involved in the cattle theft operation. Apparently, someone has been providing him with very detailed information about your activities." Hawthorne's face had gone from red to ashen gray. "That's impossible. We've been careful. You've been careful to control local law enforcement and intimidate local witnesses," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "But you forgot that some of us have lived in this territory since before there was local law enforcement. We remember how to handle problems ourselves when the official channels become corrupted. Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the elderly woman who had somehow managed to organize resistance against the criminal conspiracy while maintaining the appearance of a harmless neighbor. The scope of Mrs. Patterson's planning became clear. As Sarah considered the careful timing of her interventions, the way she had positioned herself to witness this confrontation, the federal authorities, who were apparently already en route. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, "how long have you known about their operation?" "Since Thomas started asking questions about missing cattle," the older woman replied. "Your husband was a good man, Sarah, but he wasn't subtle about his concerns. I tried to warn him to be more careful, but he felt obligated to gather evidence before making accusations." "You knew my husband was in danger," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "I suspected it, but I couldn't prove it until after his death. That's when I started my own investigation, documenting everything I could observe while staying in correspondence with federal authorities." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew grim. "I'm sorry I couldn't save Thomas, but I was determined to ensure his death would be avenged." Jake stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "Mrs. Patterson, if federal marshals are arriving tomorrow, perhaps we should consider how to keep everyone safe until then." "An excellent point," Mrs. Patterson agreed, "especially considering that these gentlemen now know their time is limited. Desperate men make poor decisions, and I suspect they're about to make several." Webb's companion, the lean man with cold eyes, had been growing increasingly restless during the conversation. Now he spoke in a low voice that carried clearly in the still air. "Marcus, we can't let them live to testify. The federal marshals, the evidence, none of it matters if there are no witnesses left to corroborate the charges." "Shut up, Coleman," Webb hissed, but the damage was done. Mrs. Patterson's rifle shifted almost imperceptibly, and Sarah noticed that Jake had positioned himself to shield her more completely from the mounted men. The pretense of civilized conversation was dissolving, revealing the violent reality that had always lurked beneath their careful words. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Patterson said conversationally, "I should mention that I'm not here alone. Several of my neighbors are positioned around the homestead, and they're all armed and experienced hunters. You might want to consider that before you make any decisions you'll regret." Sarah scanned the tree line and caught glimpses of movement that suggested Mrs. Patterson wasn't bluffing. The elderly woman had apparently organized a small army of settlers who were willing to stand against the corrupt officials who had terrorized their community. Hawthorne's authority had evaporated completely, leaving him looking like what he truly was, a criminal whose crimes had been exposed and whose time was running out. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking with stress. "You can't seriously think you can take on the law." "You're not the law," Jake said quietly. "You're criminals hiding behind badges, and now everyone knows it." Webb looked around the homestead, clearly calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. The snow was falling more heavily now, reducing visibility and making escape more difficult. His men were outnumbered by defenders who knew the terrain better and had the advantage of prepared positions. "This isn't over," he said finally. But his threat lacked the conviction it would have carried an hour earlier. "Yes, it is," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "It's been over since the moment you decided to murder my husband. You just didn't know it yet." As Webb and his men slowly wheeled their horses around, clearly planning a strategic retreat rather than a direct confrontation, Sarah felt Jake's hand slip into hers. The gesture was brief but meaningful, a reminder that whatever came next, they would face it together. The war for Cedar Falls had begun, but for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah believed that justice might actually prevail. Tomorrow would bring federal marshals and the formal end of the criminal conspiracy that had terrorized their community. Tonight would bring the final desperate actions of men who had nothing left to lose. But whatever the night held, Sarah was no longer afraid. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her partner in the fight for the future she intended to build for her child. The town meeting had been called for 7 o'clock that evening, but by 6:30, every available seat in the church hall was filled. Word of the morning's confrontation at the Henderson homestead had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, carried by Mrs. Patterson's network of allies and confirmed by the mysterious absence of Sheriff Hawthorne from his usual haunts. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and barely contained anger, as settlers who had suffered losses and endured intimidation finally saw the possibility of justice. Sarah sat in the front row, her hands folded over her belly where the baby had been unusually active all day, as if sensing the tension that surrounded them. Jake stood beside her, his father's gun visible on his hip, retrieved that afternoon from Patterson's pawn and mercantile in a transaction that had felt like reclaiming a piece of his stolen identity. The weight of the weapon was both comforting and sobering, a reminder of the man he had been and the man he was becoming again. Mrs. Patterson had taken charge of the proceedings with the natural authority of someone who had helped build the community from its earliest days. She stood at the front of the hall, beside a table that held a wooden box filled with documents, the evidence she had been methodically gathering for months while playing the role of a harmless elderly widow. "Friends and neighbors," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "We're here tonight because it's time to speak truths that have been whispered in shadows for too long. Some of you have lost cattle and been told it was rustlers. Some of you have had property damaged and been told it was accidents. Some of you have asked questions and been told to mind your own business by men who were supposed to protect and serve you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah recognized many faces from her trips to town: Martha Chen from the general store, the blacksmith and his wife, farmers and ranchers who had struggled to make honest livings while criminals operated with impunity under the protection of corrupt authority. "Tonight," Mrs. Patterson continued, "we're going to present evidence that Sheriff Ben Hawthorne and rancher Marcus Webb have been operating a systematic cattle theft operation, using falsified documents and intimidation to cover their crimes. We're going to show you proof that they murdered Thomas Whitmore when he discovered their activities, and we're going to demonstrate that they framed Jake Morrison to remove him as a potential witness to their operation." The crowd's murmur grew, louder, anger and vindication mixing in equal measure. Jake felt Sarah's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and steady, despite the magnitude of what they were revealing. Mrs. Patterson opened the wooden box and withdrew the first document. "This is a shipping manifest from the Webb Ranch, dated September 15th, showing the sale of 40 head of cattle to buyers in Cheyenne. The problem is, those same 40 head were reported stolen from the Harrison Ranch on September 10th. She held up a second paper. "This is the territorial brand registration, showing that the Harrison brand was somehow legally transferred to Webb's ownership on September 12th, 2 days after the theft was reported, and 3 days before the legitimate sale. The evidence was damning in its clarity, each document building upon the previous ones to create an undeniable picture of systematic criminal activity." Sarah watched the faces in the crowd as comprehension dawned, saw anger replace confusion as people realized the scope of the conspiracy that had operated in their midst. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice growing stronger, "I have testimony from multiple witnesses who observed cattle being moved under cover of darkness from various ranches to temporary holding areas before being transported to the Webb Ranch for legal sale." Jake stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. "I can testify that during my employment at the Webb Ranch, I observed irregularities in the cattle records and shipping manifests. When I attempted to bring these concerns to Mr. Webb's attention, I was accused of the very crimes I was trying to report." "And I can testify," Sarah said, rising carefully from her seat, "that my late husband Thomas Whitmore documented similar Concerns in letters he wrote to me before his death, letters that make clear he believed his life was in danger because of what he had discovered. She withdrew Thomas's final letter from her pocket, the paper worn from handling, but the words still clear and damning. As she read his warnings about the systematic operation and his fear for his safety, the church hall fell completely silent, except for the whisper of snow against the windows. When she finished reading, Mrs. Patterson stepped forward again. "What Mrs. Whitmore hasn't told you is that Thomas hid additional evidence before his death, evidence that we recovered from the location he specified in his letter." The elderly woman reached into the box and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with Thomas's careful handwriting. This book contains detailed records of cattle movements, brand alterations, and financial transactions that document the full scope of the criminal operation. It also includes a list of other officials who may have been compromised or threatened into cooperation. The revelation that Thomas had managed to create a comprehensive record of the conspiracy sent another wave of excited murmurs through the crowd. Jake felt a surge of admiration for a man he had never met, but whose courage and foresight were helping to bring justice to their community. "The question before us tonight," Mrs. Patterson said, "is what we do with this information. Federal marshals will arrive tomorrow to make arrests, but in the meantime, we need to ensure that justice is served and that no further crimes are committed." Before anyone could respond, the church hall's doors burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and cold air. Sheriff Hawthorne stood in the doorway, flanked by two of Webb's men, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "This illegal gathering is hereby disbanded," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his office despite everything that had been revealed about his corruption. "Anyone who doesn't leave immediately will be arrested for conspiracy and disturbing the peace." The crowd's response was not the fearful compliance Hawthorne had clearly expected. Instead, a dozen men rose from their seats, including the blacksmith, the banker, and several ranchers who had suffered losses to the theft ring. They stood in silent solidarity, making it clear that the sheriff's intimidation tactics would no longer work. "Ben Hawthorne," Mrs. Patterson said with calm authority, "you are no longer welcome in this community. Your badge has been dishonored by your crimes, and your authority has been forfeit through your actions." Hawthorne's face went white with rage. "You can't strip me of my authority, you interfering old woman. I am the law in this territory." "No," Jake said, stepping forward with his hand resting on his father's gun. "You were the law. Now you're just a criminal who's run out of places to hide." The confrontation that had been building all day was finally at hand, and Sarah realized that the baby she carried would soon learn whether justice could triumph over corruption in the frontier town that would be its home. The tension in the church hall stretched taut as a bowstring as Hawthorne and his men faced down the assembled community. But before anyone could act on the threats and counter-threats that hung in the air, Sarah doubled over with a gasp that cut through the confrontation like a knife. "The baby," she whispered, her hand gripping Jake's arm with desperate strength. "Something's wrong." Jake's attention immediately shifted from Hawthorne to Sarah, his protective instincts overriding everything else. He could see the pain in her face, the way she was struggling to breathe through what was clearly more than simple discomfort. "Mrs. Chen," he called to Martha, who had risen from her seat the moment she saw Sarah's distress. "We need to get her somewhere safe and warm." Martha Chen moved with the quick efficiency of someone who had assisted at more births than she cared to count. "Bring her to the back room," she said, already clearing a path through the crowd. "Mrs. Patterson, we'll need hot water and clean linens." But Hawthorne stepped forward, blocking their path to the back of the church. "Nobody leaves this building until this illegal assembly is dissolved and the stolen property is returned to its rightful owners." The callousness of preventing a woman in labor from receiving help shocked even some of Hawthorne's remaining supporters. Jake felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest, the protective fury of a man whose family was being threatened. "Sheriff," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You have exactly 5 seconds to get out of our way before I move you myself." "You threatening a peace officer, Morrison?" Hawthorne's hand moved toward his gun, but the gesture lacked conviction. He was outnumbered, 20-1, and everyone in the room could see it. Sarah's cry of pain galvanized the entire community. The blacksmith and 2 ranchers immediately moved to flank Hawthorne, while Mrs. Patterson and Martha Chen helped Sarah toward the back room. The confrontation that had seemed inevitable moments before was suddenly secondary to the immediate crisis of new life demanding to enter the world. "This isn't over," Hawthorne snarled, but he was backing toward the door as he spoke. The arrival of federal marshals the next morning had been guaranteed, and he clearly realized that his remaining time was better spent fleeing than fighting a battle he couldn't win. As Hawthorne and his men retreated into the snowy night, Jake followed Sarah to the back room, his heart pounding with a mixture of protective fury and overwhelming concern. Martha Chen had taken charge with the calm competence of someone who had delivered dozens of frontier babies, but even she looked worried as she examined Sarah. "The baby's coming now," Martha announced. 2 months early, but sometimes that happens when mothers are under severe stress. Jake felt his world narrow to the small room where Sarah labored to bring their child into a world that was far more dangerous and uncertain than any he would have chosen. But as he held her hand and whispered encouragement, he was struck by the profound rightness of the moment, that new life should arrive precisely when old corruption was finally being swept away. "I can see the head," Martha announced. "One more push, Sarah." The baby's first cry filled the small room, a sound so pure and demanding that it seemed to silence everything else in the world. Jake found himself looking down at a tiny, perfect human being, red-faced and furious at being thrust into the cold world, but unmistakably alive and healthy despite the early arrival. "A daughter," Martha said with a smile, wrapping the baby in clean linens. "Small but strong, just like her." "Mother," as Jake held his daughter, because that's what she was, regardless of biology, his daughter in every way that mattered, he heard the sounds of celebration from the main hall. The community had not dispersed despite Hawthorne's threats. Instead, they had remained to ensure that justice would be served and that the newest member of their community would be born into a world where law and order meant something again. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face glowing with satisfaction and joy. "The federal marshals just arrived," she announced. "They came early because of the snow, and they've already arrested Hawthorne and 2 of Webb's men trying to flee town." Sarah looked up from where she was cradling their daughter, her face exhausted, but radiant, and Webb barricaded himself in his ranch house. "But with the evidence we've gathered and the testimony we can provide, he won't be able to hide for long." Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to admire the baby. "She's beautiful, Sarah. What will you call her?" Sarah looked at Jake, and he saw a future in her eyes that included him not as a convenience or necessity, but as a true partner in building the life they both wanted. "Hope," Sarah said softly. "Her name is Hope Morrison." The baby's cry seemed to agree with the choice, a sound of protest and determination that suggested she would be well-equipped to face whatever challenges awaited her in the world her parents were fighting to make better. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of fleeing criminals and corrupt officials. But inside the warm church, surrounded by neighbors who had chosen justice over fear, a new family celebrated the victory of love over hatred, hope over despair, and the future over the past. 6 months later, the spring sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of what had once been the Henderson homestead and was now simply home. The cabin had been expanded over the winter, with a proper nursery added, where Hope slept peacefully in the hand-carved cradle that had become the centerpiece of their domestic life. The sound of Sarah's laughter drifted from the kitchen, where, She was teaching Mrs. Patterson the finer points of her mother's apple cake recipe, while Hope gurgled contentedly in her arms. Jake fingered the deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest, still sometimes surprised by the weight of it and what it represented. Federal Marshal Crawford had offered him the position after the trials concluded, recognizing that Cedar Falls needed law enforcement that the community could trust. It was honest work that used his skills and allowed him to protect the people who had stood with them when courage was needed most. The trials had been swift and decisive. Marcus Webb had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for cattle theft, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Sheriff Hawthorne had received life imprisonment for the murder of Thomas Whitmore and multiple counts of corruption. 3 other ranchers who had been part of the conspiracy received lesser sentences in exchange for their testimony, and the stolen cattle had been returned to their rightful owners. But perhaps more importantly, the community had learned to stand together against corruption. The church meetings that had begun as emergency sessions to address criminal activity had evolved into regular gatherings where neighbors discussed common problems and worked together to find solutions. Cedar Falls was becoming the kind of place where people looked out for each other, where justice meant something, and where children could grow up believing that right and wrong actually mattered. Jake walked to the kitchen window and watched Sarah as she worked, marveling again at the transformation in both their lives. The frightened widow he had found behind a barn 6 months ago had become a confident woman who ran a successful bakery from their home, supplying bread and pastries to half the territory. Her mother's recipes had become the foundation for a business that provided both income and purpose, connecting her to the traditions of the past while building something new for the future. "Deputy Morrison," Mrs. Patterson called from the kitchen, "are you going to stand there all day admiring your wife, or are you going to come help us with this cake?" Jake smiled at the old woman's teasing. Mrs. Patterson had become an honorary grandmother to Hope and an invaluable advisor to them both. Her network of allies had evolved into an informal intelligence system that helped Jake stay ahead of problems before they became serious, and her wisdom had guided them through the challenges of building a marriage and raising a child while establishing themselves in the community. He joined them in the kitchen, where Sarah handed him their daughter with the easy familiarity of parents who had learned to work as a team. Hope had grown into a remarkable baby, alert, curious, and possessed of a sunny disposition that seemed to light up every room she entered. She had her mother's dark eyes and what appeared to be her father's stubborn chin, along with a laugh that could make even the grumpiest settler smile. "How did the morning patrol go?" Sarah asked, settling flour into a bowl with practiced efficiency. "Quiet," Jake replied, bouncing Hope gently in his arms. "Old Henderson stopped by the office to say he's thinking of coming back to reclaim his land. Says he heard Cedar Falls has become a good place to raise a family again." "It has," Sarah said with satisfaction, "thanks to people who were willing to fight for what was right." Jake thought about the circuitous path that had brought them to this moment. His fall from grace had seemed like the end of everything he valued, but it had actually been the beginning of something better than anything he had previously imagined. Losing his father's ranch had hurt, but building a life with Sarah and Hope felt like a more meaningful legacy than anything he could have accomplished alone. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention, and Jake moved to the window to see Martha Chen riding up the path with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger wore traveling clothes and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but his expression was pleasant as he dismounted and followed Martha to the front door. "Jake, Sarah," Martha called as they stepped onto the porch, "I'd like you to meet Jonathan Whitmore, Thomas's brother from back east." Sarah's face went pale, and Jake instinctively moved closer to her, offering silent support. This was the family connection she had traveled west to find, the relatives who might have provided help during her darkest hours if circumstances had been different. Jonathan Whitmore was a distinguished man in his 50s, with Thomas's gentle eyes and an air of quiet competence. When he spoke, his voice carried the educated cadence of someone who had spent his life in cities rather than on the frontier. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, using Sarah's married name with careful respect, "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I came as soon as I received Mrs. Chen's letter about my brother's death and the circumstances surrounding it." "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion, "I'm grateful you came. Thomas spoke of you often, and I know he would be happy to know you're here." Jonathan's gaze moved to Hope, who was studying him with the serious attention that babies reserved for new faces. "And this must be my niece. Thomas wrote about the baby in his last letter, how excited he was about becoming a father. Would you like to hold her?" Sarah asked, and Jake felt a surge of pride at her generosity. Despite everything she had endured, alone, she was willing to share their daughter with family who might have legitimate claims on the child's affection and future. Jonathan accepted Hope with the careful reverence of someone who understood the precious nature of what he held. The baby studied his face solemnly for a moment, then broke into the radiant smile that had charmed everyone who met her. "She's beautiful," Jonathan said softly. "She has Thomas's eyes, but I suspect she has her parents' strength." As they moved inside for coffee and conversation, Jake reflected on the way life had of bringing things full circle. The family Sarah had sought when she first came west had finally found her, but she no longer needed them for survival. Instead, they could offer each other something richer: connection, shared memories of Thomas, and the knowledge that Hope would grow up understanding her full heritage. Later that evening, after Jonathan had left for town with promises to return, the next day for a longer visit, Jake and Sarah sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Hope slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, and the sounds of the valley, wind through the trees, the distant call of a meadowlark, the gentle lowing of their cattle, created a symphony of contentment. "Do you ever think about that morning behind the barn?" Sarah asked quietly, "when you were eating that rotten apple and I found you?" Jake smiled, remembering the man he had been then, broken, hopeless, reduced to surviving on scraps and charity. "Every day," he said. "It was the best, worst day of my life." "Mine too," Sarah agreed. "I thought I was just helping a stranger, but I was actually saving my own future." Jake reached over to take her free hand, marveling again at the journey that had brought them from desperation to this moment of perfect peace. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight, the cradle visible through the window where it waited for Hope's return. Around them, the valley stretched toward mountains that no longer seemed harsh and forbidding, but protective and permanent. They had built something worth keeping, something worth fighting for, something that would last. Long after they were gone, in the hand-carved cradle, in the recipes Sarah had taught their neighbors, in the justice they had helped bring to their community, in the daughter who would carry their love into the future, in all of these things, their story would continue. Stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and Jake Morrison found himself thinking about his father, about Thomas Whitmore, about all the good people whose sacrifices had made this moment possible. He hoped they would approve of what he and Sarah had built from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Hope stirred in her mother's arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to hold all the promise of tomorrow. And in that moment, Jake knew with absolute certainty that some things, love, family, the courage to do what's right, were worth any price, any struggle, any sacrifice required to protect them. The rotten apple was just a memory now, replaced by the sweet taste of a life well lived and a future full of hope.